we have that information moving forward. One last point, we also have enabled our transcription services. So if you do need to access those services, feel free to click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll go ahead and get started from here. All right, next slide, please, Dewey. Great. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Emerald Cities Collaborative, I do want to take a moment to introduce ourselves. Emerald Cities, also known as ECC, is a nationwide nonprofit coalition. We work at the intersection of environmental, economic, and racial justice, hence our three-part mission that we have listed on the screen. We strive to green our cities, build our communities, and strengthen our democracy. We are a Black-led organization with regional offices in California, Washington, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C., and then in addition to our regional offices, we also have our staff supporting projects across the country. So if you want more information about Emerald Cities and the work that we're doing, you can find us online at emeraldcities.org. Next slide, please, Dewey. So as I mentioned, this is the first webinar of our three-part series focusing on community benefits. In this webinar, we'll be focusing on the Biden-Harris administration's Justice40 initiative. Then we'll talk about how this initiative will influence relevant federal legislation. And then we'll get into some of the tools that exist to support community engagement with these federal resources. The second webinar will focus more so on developing community benefit plans. And the final webinar will discuss tools for implementing community benefit plans to achieve community benefits. We will be sure to make sure that we send out information on those last two webinars as soon as we get that squared away. All right, so for today's agenda, we'll start with the language from the executive order that established the Justice40 initiative, and then we'll move into some of the relevant federal spending bills that have been passed in recent years, while also touching on how Justice40 might influence implementation of those spending bills. And then we'll get into the People's Justice40 Plus Community Benefit Playbook and how communities can use this resource as an organizing tool to obtain community benefits. And then finally, we'll close with a brief description of community benefit plans, and that will round out our webinar. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with that, we'll move into the Justice40 initiative. So within the first couple of the weeks of the Biden-Harris administration, President Biden signed Executive Order 14008, which is more commonly known as Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. This was an executive order that the administration used to establish the Justice40 initiative. So what is the Justice40 initiative? This initiative sets out an agency-wide goal that at least 40% of overall benefits of certain federal investments will be flowing toward disadvantaged communities. Now, given some of the misconception about what Justice40 is, I want to be very clear that Justice40 is a goal that was established by this administration to further embed equity in the way that federal agencies are implementing their agency programs in order to make sure that the communities that need their program resources the most are seeing the benefit from their programs. So I just, again, want to be clear, Justice40 is a goal. It is not a law or a line item funding that was passed by Congress. It's not legal precedent set by the Supreme Court. Justice40 is a goal that 40% of overall benefits of certain federal investments are targeted toward disadvantaged communities. And so for those of you who are dialing in by phone, I've highlighted a few key terms within this goal. Specifically, I've bolded benefits, I've bolded federal investments, and I've also bolded disadvantaged communities. I want to call attention to those key terms because I think that the way in which these terms are defined, this will really play a role in determining the impact of this initiative. And while the executive order that established the Justice40 initiative did not define benefits in disadvantaged communities, it did clearly identify what the administration meant by certain federal investments, and I've included those here. So we've got clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable and sustainable housing, training and workforce development, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, development of clean water infrastructure. So then in addition to those 6 types of federal investments, when the White House the White House's Office of Management and Budget released its interim implementation guidance on how federal agencies should be implementing Justice 40, they added that overarching investment category of climate change. So anytime a program within a federal agency makes an investment in the 6 investment categories we have listed here, and then the 7th category of climate change, that is that should make sure that people think that this program will fall within the scope of Justice 40. So I think just whenever people talk about Justice 40, think about these key federal investment areas. And if a program is focusing on these areas, that means it should fall within Justice 40. Next slide, please, Daly. So as I previously stated, shortly after the Justice 40 initiative was established, the Office of Management and Budget released its interim implementation guidance that specifically detailed how federal agencies should go about implementing their Justice 40 programs. So specifically, this guidance created 2 mandates for our federal agencies. That first mandate required all of the federal agencies to first identify programs within their agencies that made investments in the 7 investment categories that we just discussed. Again, those programs be referred to as Justice 40 covered programs. And then once they've identified those programs, agencies were then required to identify and define the program benefits that each of those programs provided, and then articulate how the agency is going to measure and track those program benefits to see how much, if any, of those program benefits were making their way into disadvantaged communities. So essentially, this first mandate was kind of a landscape analysis to get agencies not only to understand which other programs would fall within Justice 40, but to make sure that they've clearly identified what benefits that those programs provide, and then make sure that they had a mechanism in place to try to track and then measure those benefits, so that way they could see how much of those benefits were actually making its way into disadvantaged communities. And then that second mandate, the Justice 40 pilot program, this program specifically focuses on 21 federal programs that make Justice 40 investments, and directed these programs to make sure that they are maximizing benefits to disadvantaged communities. So what does that mean? So essentially what each of these federal agencies were trying to do was, with these specific 21 programs, they wanted to identify ways of ensuring disadvantaged communities are receiving the program benefits, but specifically they wanted to identify any barriers or constraints that disadvantaged communities might be having to actually participating in these programs. And then once they identified those barriers and constraints, then they wanted looking for ways that they could find opportunities and resources to address or alleviate any of those barriers. Again, trying to ensure that that any way that the programs were, to make sure that the way that they were facilitating the programs, that they could not only identify that people were benefiting from those programs, but making sure that there weren't any barriers or any constraints to them accessing those programs. So those were essentially the 2 main mandates that came out of the Justice 40 interim implementation guidance. Next slide, Daly. But in addition to those 2 key benefits, I think what I really want to hone in on is what that interim implementation guidance did was identify some of those key terms that I highlighted within the Justice 40 goal. So first, specifically, they defined benefits. In the way that they defined benefits, they defined it in a way to include direct and indirect benefits and program outcomes that positively impact disadvantaged communities. So in addition to just creating that definition, what the guidance did, it also provided different examples of how agencies can be thinking about their programs and what types of benefits the administration had intended would fall within this benefit category. So some of the things that they talked about were creating community microgrids, or increasing clean energy job training participation, or lead service line replacement. So very broad types of benefits. And so I think, and it's important when we're talking about what are Justice 40 benefits, it's really going to depend on what type of program you're looking at. And that's how we're going to really hone in on what types of benefits that the agency is thinking about, what could, how the programs could benefit their communities. So that second definition that they also elaborated on within the Justice 40 implementation guidance was disadvantaged communities. So what the guidance did was it identified different factors and different data that the agencies could use when identifying disadvantaged communities. And some of those factors related back to employment, income levels, types of energy and housing burden, or water affordability. But ultimately, the guidance really pointed to the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, more commonly referred to as CJST. And this tool was specifically designed to help agencies define and identify disadvantaged communities for the purpose of meeting that Justice40 goal. So last year, the Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, they released its final version of this of CJST. And while it's worth pointing out that CEQ did make some updates to CJST to include more data sets, it was a little disheartening to see that racial demographics, while included in the tool, it isn't necessarily listed as, it's not necessarily included in their methodology. So if you have an opportunity to take a look at CJST, please do. It's my understanding that they're still getting feedback on how CJST is working, but just want to highlight this tool because it is going to be kind of a defining way in which agencies will be able to say whether or not their programs are benefiting disadvantaged communities. So take a look at the tool, see if your community is included, and if it's not, provide that feedback and include any data sets that you think that would encompass your community and make sure it's identified within the disadvantaged tool or within CJST. All right, next slide, please, Daly. So now that we've kind of talked through some of the implementation guidance that was provided to agencies as to how they should be implementing Justice40, let's talk about how it actually translated into federal action. So last year, federal agencies started releasing complete lists of their current Justice40 covered programs. You can find that list housed on the White House Environmental Justice website. As of right now, we have not seen a complete entire list of all of the agency Justice40 programs, but there are a good bit of agencies that have started identifying their programs. And I think what's really good to hear is that some of those identified Justice40 covered programs are also receiving additional funding through some of the federal spending bills that we're going to be talking about here soon as well. And then we've also started to see that prior to CEQ releasing CJST, we did start to see some agencies have started to create and update their own environmental justice screening tools to align with how the White House was advising them on how to define disadvantaged communities. So we started seeing more and more tools coming out from specific agencies, specifically EPA and the Department of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Transportation. And then I will also say that some federal agencies also started to publish their own Justice40 implementation guidance to make sure that their program funding applicants understand how they will be expected to speak to Justice40 within their funding applications. And while I will say that I have not seen any agencies publish details on their program benefits and how those benefits are being tracked and measured, in addition to creating the Justice40 goal, the executive order also required the Council on Environmental Quality to create an online environmental justice scorecard, which will track the administration's progress on meeting their environmental justice goals, which includes Justice40. So hopefully when we see that environmental justice scorecard released, we'll get some clarity as to not just what programs each agency is considering Justice40, but specifically what benefits those each programs provide, and also how they are tracking and measuring those benefits to make sure that they're actually getting into disadvantaged communities. So that's what we've seen with federal justice implementation thus far. So now that we've kind of grounded ourselves in the Justice40 initiative, let's kind of get into some of the more relevant federal spending bills that have been passed in recent years. And let's unpack what influence, if any, we will see of the Justice40, we will see that Justice40 has on their implementation. So over the next few slides, I'll provide an overview of the American Rescue Plan Act, the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, or also commonly known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And then I'll also get into the Inflation Reduction Act. Each of these specific spending bills represent opportunities to build community benefits. Next slide, please, Dewey. Thank you. So before we just get into before we dig into the funding bills, I do want to highlight some of the different funding mechanisms that you'll see in each of these bills. So it's important to understand the types of funding mechanisms because based on each type of funding mechanism, that will kind of chart the pathway from federal agency and how we will see that funding show up in our individual communities. So with the two primary forms of funding mechanisms, they're going to be formula grants and competitive grants. With formula grants, federal agencies will distribute funding directly from federal agencies to states and local governments. And this is based on a predetermined funding formula that's usually outlined in either the statute or within agency guidance. Usually this funding is automatically distributed to state and local governments. However, I will say that with some of the funding formula, some of the formula funding that was allocated through both the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, federal agencies are starting to require states to submit applications in order to receive their funding allocation. I think this really does present a unique opportunity for communities to actually insert themselves within that formula funding process. So in some of these applications for formula funding, I'm starting to see agencies asking states to speak to how they will be embedding things like equity, community engagement, and the Justice40 initiative within their funding applications. This is a great way for communities to engage their state and local officials and really start advocating for procedural equity, community named benefits, and Justice40 throughout the funding application and planning and implementation process. I want to highlight this moment because this is something that we have not necessarily seen before. And if the way that they have been structuring this process around, for example, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, they're really going to be providing guidance and handholding with states to really engage them on these elements. And so the more we as community members can also engage them on these elements, the more likely we'll start to see them implementing some of these, implementing more procedural equity and making sure that they're complying with the Justice40 initiative. So that is mainly the process for formula grant funding, but I also want to touch on competitive grants. So with competitive grants, anyone who is eligible for funding can apply for that grant. But because the funding is competitive, the federal government can usually attach more criteria here than just the formula funding. So that means they can be a little more explicit as to how they want funding applicants to show how Justice40 is going to show up in their program or their project. Again, this funding process presents a great opportunity for community engagement. More often, we're really starting to see competitive grant applicants being asked to specifically outline what is your community engagement plan or what is your community benefit plan? And then how are you working to ensure that communities are benefiting from your program or your project. So this, again, creates an opportunity for communities to really insert themselves in this this process of competitive grant applications, specifically really speaking to how they want to see community engagement around specific federally funded projects. So in addition to formula and competitive grants, we'll also see different types of opportunities for loans and loan forgiveness programs. And then also with Inflation Reduction Act, you'll start to see a lot of tax credits and rebates showing up within those two federal spending bills too. For the most part, we'll really focus on formula grant funding and competitive grant funding, just because those are typically, those are the main types of funding mechanisms you see in federal spending bills, but with the Inflation Reduction Act, we'll see that tax credits and rebates also play a prominent role in how the bill is going to be implemented. So that's just an overview of the different types of funding mechanisms that you'll see in these bills. Again, I think it's important to highlight those types of those different funding opportunities, because depending on the type of funding opportunity will give you some background on how you can expect that funding to actually show up within your community and who specifically, which hands it'll have to pass through to get to your community, because understanding that process will allow for different intervention from community to influence that process. So with that, we'll move into the American Rescue Plan Act. Thanks, Dewey. Okay, so with this first federal spending bill, the American Rescue Plan, or as I will abbreviate it, and as you may commonly hear it abbreviated as ARPA. ARPA was signed very early on in the Biden administration, and this was to provide additional aid to both state and local governments, frontline workers, and families during the pandemic. Of the pools of this funding within this legislation, I'll specifically be focusing our attention on the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, which was around $350 billion in funding. So this funding does consist of formula grants. So again, the funding pathway that it will take to get to your community, as it will go from federal agency to state, local, and tribal government officials before it will eventually work its way into individual communities. It's also important to note that this funding, typically with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, we'll see a 10-year timeline in terms of how long state and local governments have to spend that funding. But with this bill specifically, we're under a lot more tight time. They're on a tighter turnaround, if you will. So funding under this program must be obligated by the end of 2024, and it must be spent by 2026. So those are two important timelines for our government officials. So it's important for us to keep an eye on that as well, in terms of what it's going to, in terms of how we are going to also track the funding and how it's going to show up in our communities. So again, while this is an expedited timeline, it does offer some potential community benefits. Specifically, this funding, it creates economic recovery opportunities for frontline workers through the premium pay benefits. And then it also specifically names water and sewer infrastructure investments as an eligible use of funding. And then again, as I mentioned, because of the tight turnaround, there is some enhanced transparency into how this funding is being spent. The Department of Treasury specifically requires that state, local, and tribal governments are required to report on how they're spending their funding formula. I will definitely drop that link in the chat. It'll be linked in the slides when you get them. Again, I would encourage folks to check this out, just because some of the ways that we've been hearing state and local government spending this funding is not necessarily for community benefit. So I think the more that we know about how our funding is being spent, the more we can draw attention to it and ensure that our community or government officials understand that we are watching, and that we want them to pay more attention, or we would like them to focus their attention more so into what we would say are community named benefits and how they're spending that funding. So with that, we'll move into the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. This bill some people might more commonly refer to it as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or EJA, as I will like to refer to it. But IJA was passed in November 2021 and invested about $1.9 trillion in programs and funding opportunities to improve our built infrastructure. So what I mean when I say built infrastructure, I mean things like roads, bridges, energy grids, and commercial and residential buildings. So unlike the American Rescue Plan, federal agencies do have a lot more time to allocate and spend down this funding. Overall, they have about 10 years to spend this funding, starting with the fiscal year of 2022. And just for those who aren't familiar, the federal fiscal year starts October 1st and runs through September 30th of the following year. So given that the primary focus of this bill is strengthening our built infrastructure, most of the community benefits will come in the form of workforce or contractor development opportunities. However, there is funding available for different community programs. Specifically, there's additional funding for the weatherization assistance program that helps ensure low-income families have access to energy-efficient homes. EJA also expands funding for clean and safe drinking water through state revolving loan programs, where states are being directed to forgive those loans for disadvantaged communities. EJA also includes funding to close the digital divide by funding programs that target equitable and accessible internet connectivity and broadband. And then with the Department of Transportation receiving a ton of funding, they received funding to build out our electric vehicle infrastructure, electrify our public transportation, school buses, and to reconnect communities that have been severed by or divided by previous infrastructure investments. So a lot of opportunities for community benefits here within this bill. And then considering that most of this funding will be distributed through formula and competitive grants, again, it's important that communities are working in coalition with their state and local government officials to access these programs and funding opportunities, especially if the program falls within the Justice40 initiative. So speaking of the Justice40 initiative, as it relates to how it might influence implementation of EJA, specifically, I will highlight that while it's to be seen just how much of the funding actually flows into disadvantaged communities, it is worth noting that shortly after the bill was signed, President Biden did sign an additional executive order that detailed his priorities for implementing EJA, and one of those priorities specifically was he named investing public dollars through the Justice40 initiative. So hopefully, as federal agencies are implementing the programs that were funded through this bill, they're keeping a keen eye on ensuring that Justice40 is being implemented as well. So that is the the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. And now we'll move into the final bill that we'll provide an overview of, and that is the Inflation Reduction Act. So IRA was, the Inflation Reduction Act, or also shortcutted as IRA, or the IRA, was signed in August of last year, and it invests $369 billion in energy security and clean energy programs over the next 10 years, beginning in fiscal year 2022. So very much similar to the Inflation Reduction Act. However, I do want to highlight that with the Inflation Reduction Act, while most of the programs have 10 years for the funding to be allocated, there are some programs within the bill that are on a shorter time frame. I want to highlight one specifically, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Specifically, this funding must be allocated by the end of fiscal year 2024. So it's important that as we identify different programs within the Inflation Reduction Act that are relevant to our communities, we're also keeping an eye on how much time the funding has to be allocated, because that will depend on how much time we have to get our plans together, to get plans or projects together to submit for funding opportunities. I will also say that similar to EJA, a lot of the community benefits within the bill will come from workforce and contractor development opportunities. It was a little more explicit within the Inflation Reduction Act in that specifically prevailing wage and apprenticeship incentives were named, contractor and workforce training opportunities were named throughout the Inflation Reduction Act. But in addition to those those workforce and contractor development opportunities, there were also quite a bit of opportunities for community benefits as well. So within IRA, we're seeing a lot of rebates for home electrification and energy efficiency modifications. I think some of those, it's important to note that can be used at the point of sale to reduce costs of electrification or energy efficient appliances. We're also starting to see a lot of additional funding going to the Department of Transportation, again, for increased efforts to electrify public and school transportation fleets, to promote cleaner transportations through cleaner transportation opportunities in communities. And then also, I will say, for the first time I have seen, community-based organizations are directly eligible for funding through some of the environmental and climate justice grants. Specifically, they can receive this funding for community projects that will reduce or monitor air pollution, both indoor and outdoor, projects that build community climate resilience, projects that will mitigate climate and health risks due to extreme heat, and then also using that funding to increase community engagement efforts to really ensure that communities have the capacity to engage with some of these federal programs that have historically been inaccessible due to various types of red tape, reporting requirements, grant required or different grant writing skills, et cetera. So do want to highlight that there is opportunities for community-based organizations to apply directly for funding. I think one thing that I will highlight, though, with some of the programs that we're seeing within the Inflation Reduction Act, because they are new programs, we're still waiting anxiously for how these programs will be implemented, specifically looking for program guidance from different agencies. I will say that as we start to see that roll out, ECC will be be keeping track of that information and then including that information in our monthly updates. So make sure you subscribe to those so that way you're able to get that information as well. And then finally, as with the EJA, after the IRA was passed, President Biden also signed another executive order specifically making Justice40 a priority in IRA implementation. So hopefully, as we start to see IRA roll out within this program guidance, we'll see agencies really specifically speaking to the Justice40 initiative. So it's very clear from our perspective as to how we can anticipate those benefits flowing into disadvantaged communities. So that's just kind of an overview of all of those bills. I understand that was a lot of information all at once, but you can always check out our People's Justice40 Plus Community Benefits Playbook. We take a deeper dive on each of those spending bills, specifically ARPA and the American Rescue Plan Act, as well as EJA. But I will say that we are working on our next iteration of the playbook. So once that's released, you'll get a deeper dive on the Inflation Reduction Act as well. And with that, let's go ahead and dive into the People's Justice40 Plus Community Benefit Playbook. All right, so here in Emerald Cities, as it relates to Justice40, really our primary focus has been on how can we support communities in this moment and build community capacity to organize around Justice40 in order to ensure that communities are realizing the benefits of this initiative. So this primary focus was really the impetus for the People's Justice40 Plus Community Benefit Playbook. This playbook is, as I've stated, an organizing tool that communities can really use to deepen their knowledge of federal policies and different types of spending bills, and then use that knowledge to build community-led coalitions around obtaining those community benefits. So what is the playbook and how do we anticipate you'll be using this? So just to kind of walk you through the playbook, the first 3 sections provide a primer on the Justice40 initiative and some of the major federal spending bills that have been passed within the past few years and that offer the potential to address community needs, very much similar to what we discussed today, focusing on the American Rescue Plan Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. And then, as I stated, the next iteration will really focus on the IRA as well. But in the next 5 sections of the playbook, specifically, we'll take a deeper dive into 5 areas of community need. So specifically, we'll be getting into energy, water, economic inclusion, environmental and climate justice, and transportation justice. And then within each of these 5 areas of need, we really highlight the components these 3 components surrounding the potential funding opportunities. So first, we provide additional tools and resources that help deepen community knowledge in those specific community areas. But then within that, we try to connect community concerns to different potential funding opportunities that are available under the Inflation Reduction or the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. And then finally, we identify the different stakeholders that folks should be working with in coalition to help access those funding. So we lay it out in a very visually appealing grid of identifying what are your community concerns, what funding opportunities are there to meet those concerns, and then specifically who you should be in community with to access that federal funding. So really focusing on those three concepts within each of the different sector playbooks. And then finally, that last chapter really dives into creating community benefit plans. Next slide, please, Davey. So what are community benefit plans? Considering that there are a couple federal agencies that have been calling for public funding applicants to include community benefit plans within their applications, I do want to be very clear on what Emerald Cities means when we say community benefit plans. To meet the ECC definition of a community benefit plan, these plans must center community. While that seems like it would be a given, it's not necessarily the case. So when we say community centered, we really mean that these plans must be community led and community developed. They must be rooted in equity principles and values, and they must focus on the needs and priorities of the community. And then once these plans can be developed, they can be used to deepen a coalition of community members. They can be used to create tools for advocacy around specific state or federal programs or funding opportunities, or they can be used to advise public or private project developers on community benefits. But the most important thing is that they are inclusive of community, that they center the needs of community and they defer to community. Really want to emphasize that point, just because it's a community benefit plan does not necessarily mean it is inclusive of community. And for Emerald Cities, in order for community benefit plans to be true community benefit plans, they must be led by community. So we're coming to a close of our presentation today. Next slide, please, Dewi. Thank you so much. I appreciate you tuning in to listen to me ramble on about Justice40 and all the different opportunities for community benefits. If you want to know more, please stay tuned for our next community benefit plan, the next segment of our community benefit plans webinar series. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email eccpolicy@emeraldcities.org. Unfortunately, we were not able to take questions directly live today, but I'm sure that we will make sure that we capture all of the questions in the chat that were asked, and I will be sure to follow up with a one-pager in addition to the slides in the recording for folks to get those answers. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate y'all.